An arrogant millionaire tried to humiliate a young woman by challenging her with an impossible calculation. He was certain she wouldn't even know where to begin in front of the attentive crowd. But when she decided to respond, something unexpected happened, and no one could react. If this beautiful story of triumph and love interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching from. Continuing, the September morning arrived with that typical Boston heat, when autumn still resisted showing itself and summer insisted on lingering. On the campus of Hudson University in the Cambridge district, the hallways of the Institute of Mathematics and Statistics were already buzzing with the characteristic movement of the start of the semester. Hurried students carried bulky books, chatted excitedly about the vacations left behind, and commented, in tones varying between admiration and fear, about the subjects they would face ahead. Among all the rooms in that imposing building, there was one that provoked especially intense feelings. Room 207 on the third floor was the territory of Dr. Richard Thorne, a tenured professor of advanced calculus and number theory, a man whose reputation preceded him in every hallway, in every coffee break between classes, and in every nervous sigh of a freshman discovering his name on the attendance sheet. Richard Thorne was not just a professor, he was an institution within the institution. At 42 years old, he had accumulated academic awards, publications in prestigious international journals, and a considerable fortune built through consulting for large corporations and successful investments in the financial market. His upright posture, impeccably tailored suits, Italian shoes that shone under the fluorescent lights of the classrooms, and the Swiss watch resting on his left wrist, composed the image of a man who knew exactly the value the world attributed to him. And Richard didn't just accept that value, he demanded it. On that Thursday morning, Richard entered room 207 with firm, calculated steps, greeting the class with a dry nod. The students, about 35 in total, quieted instantly. Some nervously adjusted their notebooks on their desks. Others exchanged complicit glances like soldiers about to enter battle. Richard placed his genuine leather briefcase on the table, opened it with precise movements, and took out a blue marker. His eyes scanned the room with that expression everyone knew, a mixture of challenge and ill-disguised superiority. "This subject is not for the faint of heart," he began, his voice echoing clearly through the room. "Here you won't find professors who coddle those who don't put in the effort. Here mathematics is presented in its purest and most implacable form. If anyone still has doubts about whether they are in the right place, the door remains where it has always been." No one moved. Richard gave a half-smile, satisfied with the tense silence that dominated the environment. He loved that power, that ability to make brilliant young people feel small in his presence. To him, this wasn't cruelty. It was pedagogy. It was the way to separate the truly talented from the mediocre who were merely taking up space. He began writing on the board, developing a complex differential equation, explaining each step with the confidence of someone who mastered that territory like no one else. The students followed frantically, some taking detailed notes, others just trying to absorb the reasoning unfolding before them. It was then that the classroom door opened. The subtle sound of the handle turning was enough to interrupt the flow of the class. All eyes turned toward the entrance. Richard stopped mid-sentence, marker still suspended in the air, and turned with an expression of evident annoyance. A young woman entered the room with hesitant steps, apologizing in a low voice. She carried a worn backpack on her shoulders, the kind that had seen better days, and wore simple jeans, faded at the knees, combined with a white cotton t-shirt and canvas sneakers that had lost their original white color a long time ago. Her dark hair was tied in a practical ponytail, without any aesthetic pretension. There was no makeup on her face, only the expression of someone visibly out of her natural element. The entire room watched her, not with overt hostility, but with that veiled curiosity that arises when something clashes with the established standard. There, in that environment where most students arrived by car, wore designer clothes, and carried the latest laptops, the presence of that simple-looking young woman created a contrast impossible to ignore. Richard examined her from head to toe, his eyes scanning every detail of the figure who had just invaded his territory. A smile appeared on his lips, but it wasn't a welcoming one. It was the smile of a predator who had just identified easy prey. "Are you lost, miss?" he asked with an artificial kindness that barely hid the sarcasm. "The prep course is in the building next door." A few muffled laughs echoed through the room. The young woman felt her cheeks burn, but she maintained her posture. She opened her backpack and took out a crumpled piece of paper, extending it toward Richard. "I am enrolled in this course, Professor. Maya Sterling. I got the spot through the university's social equity program." Richard took the paper with 2 fingers, as if fearing contamination, and quickly examined the document. Indeed, her name was on the official list. He returned the paper with a dismissive gesture and pointed to an empty desk at the back of the room. "Sit down then, and next time arrive on time. Punctuality is the first lesson you need to learn here." Maya walked to the indicated desk, feeling the weight of all those stares on her. As she sat down, she took an old notebook from her backpack, its cover half loose, and a blue pen that she held as if it were her most precious possession. Richard returned to the board, but the interruption had changed something in his dynamic. He seemed even more determined to demonstrate authority, to reaffirm his absolute dominance over that space. He continued to develop the equation, but now his comments were loaded with additional irony. Small remarks about how this content was too difficult for those without the proper foundation, and how some there might never be able to keep up with the necessary pace. Maya noted everything down. Her pen glided across the paper with surprising speed, capturing not only the equations, but also the observations Richard made. Her eyes, attentive and focused, didn't miss a single detail. There was something in her concentration that seemed absolute, as if the world around her had ceased to exist, and only she and that knowledge being revealed on the board remained. Richard, with his peripheral vision trained by years in the classroom, noticed that intense attention, and it bothered him, more than it should have. There was something about that girl that challenged his expectations, and he didn't like being surprised. He didn't like having his certainties questioned. He decided then to do what he did best: test, challenge, expose. He stopped his explanation in the middle and turned to the class. "Let's do things differently today. I want to see who has actually understood what has been presented so far." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. This was how Richard operated. He transformed classes into arenas, knowledge into a weapon, and students into gladiators forced to fight for approval. His eyes scanned the room and inevitably landed on Maya. The smile reappeared. "Miss Sterling, since you arrived so eager to learn, how about demonstrating your understanding? Come up here to the front." Maya looked up from her notebook. For a second, she hesitated. But then, with a courage she didn't know she had, she closed her notebook and stood up. The walk to the front of the room seemed endless. Each step echoed in her ears, mixed with the sound of her own racing heart. She could feel the stares, some curious, others pitiful, anticipating the embarrassment that was to come. Richard erased part of the board, and with deliberately theatrical movements, began writing a new equation. This time, it was something even more complex. A number theory problem involving advanced concepts of abstract algebra, combinatorics, and proofs that required not just technical knowledge, but also mathematical creativity. When he finished, he stepped back and crossed his arms over his chest, leaning against the desk with the posture of someone who already knew the outcome of this theater. "This is a classic problem, but with some variations I developed myself. Few of my doctoral students can solve it on the first try. Let's see what you can do with it, Miss Sterling. After all, you are here to learn, aren't you?" Maya looked at the board. The equation danced before her eyes, complex and intimidating. Around her, the silence was absolute. Some students already looked away, anticipating failure, while others watched with that characteristic morbidity of someone witnessing an accident about to happen. But then something changed in Maya's face. Her eyes, which before seemed scared, gained a different spark. She took a step forward, picked up the marker Richard had left on the table, and approached the board. Richard smiled, satisfied with himself. In a few minutes she would admit defeat, and he would have proven his point. That environment wasn't for everyone. It wasn't for girls who arrived with dirty sneakers and old backpacks, pretending they belonged to a world that wasn't theirs. Maya began to write. And that was when the impossible began to happen. Maya's first movements on the board were cautious, almost timid, She held the marker firmly, but there was a delicacy in how the blue tip touched the white surface, as if she were asking for permission to exist in that space that hadn't been made for her. The room remained in absolute silence, a type of silence that seemed to have weight pressing down on the shoulders of everyone there. Maya began by rewriting the equation Richard had proposed, but in a slightly different form. Her eyes scanned every symbol, every variable, as if she were having a silent conversation with the numbers. Then, without rushing, she initiated the first algebraic transformation. What caught everyone's attention wasn't just the fact that she knew where to start. It was the way she did it. There was an uncommon elegance in her reasoning, a way of organizing thought that seemed to flow naturally, without the typical stumbles of someone who is insecure. She wasn't trying to impress, she was simply solving. Richard, still leaning against the table with his arms crossed, watched with an expression that fluctuated between curiosity and growing irritation. He expected to see hesitation, an error, the inevitable moment when she would have to admit defeat. But that moment didn't come. On the contrary, Maya advanced through the problem with a confidence that challenged all the expectations he had built in the first minutes of that class. The second stage of the resolution brought a simplification that even some of the best students in the class hadn't considered. Maya applied a mathematical property that, while not obscure, was rarely remembered in practical situations. It was the kind of insight that separated those who truly understood math from those who merely memorized formulas. A discreet murmur ran through the room. Some students exchanged looks of surprise. Others leaned forward, trying to better follow the reasoning unfolding on the board. There was something mesmerizing about that scene, something that transcended the simple resolution of an academic problem. Maya continued, now with even more confidence. Her hands moved with purpose, developing each step with crystal clarity. She wasn't just solving, she was teaching. Each line she added to the board was a demonstration of profound understanding, of true mastery over that abstract universe of numbers and symbols. When she reached the most complex part of the problem, the one that required not just technique but mathematical creativity, Maya paused for a moment. Her eyes narrowed, concentrated. Richard allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. There it was. The moment she would find her limit. The moment the fantasy would end and reality would impose itself. But Maya didn't give up. Instead, she took a step back, analyzed the entire board, and then did something that left even Richard speechless. She presented an alternative approach, a path he himself hadn't considered when he created that variation of the problem. It was a more direct, more elegant solution that reached the same result through an unexpected route. The room exploded in murmurs. They were no longer discreet whispers. It was a genuine buzz of surprise and admiration. Some students stood up to see better what was written. Others remained seated, but with expressions of shock plastered on their faces. Maya completed the last line of the proof and stepped away from the board. She placed the marker on the table carefully, as if it was something precious that needed to be treated with respect. Her eyes met Richard's, and in them there was no arrogance or defiance. There was only a serene tranquility, the peace of someone who did what needed to be done. Richard approached the board with measured steps. His face had lost that expression of confident superiority. Now there was something more complex there, a mixture of incredulity, involuntary respect, and, if one looked closely enough, a touch of repressed anger. He examined every line, every symbol, every algebraic transformation. He looked for errors. He looked for flaws. He looked for anything he could use to disqualify that impossible performance. He found nothing. The solution was perfect. More than perfect. It was inspired. Maya returned to her desk at the back of the room, and for the first time since she had entered that environment, she allowed a slight smile to touch her lips. It wasn't a smile of victory or mockery. It was just the smile of someone who had just proven to herself that she belonged in that place regardless of what others thought. The class continued, but nothing was as it was before. Richard tried to regain his authoritarian posture, but there was a crack in his armor that everyone could see. The students looked at Maya with renewed curiosity, no longer with that veiled disdain from the beginning, but with genuine interest. Who was this girl? Where did she come from? How had she learned to think that way? When the class ended, Maya was the first to leave. She packed her old notebook into her worn backpack, put her pen in her pocket, and left the room with the same discretion with which she had arrived. But if before she was invisible, now it was impossible not to notice her. In the hallway, as she walked toward the building exit, Maya allowed herself a moment for a deep breath. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the rush of adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She had passed. She had survived the first test, but she knew this was only the beginning. Maya Sterling didn't come from a family that attended universities. She grew up in the South End projects, one of the toughest neighborhoods in the city, in a 3-room apartment that her mother, Sarah, kept impeccably clean despite the precarious conditions. Her father had left when she was a child, leaving Sarah alone to raise Maya and her younger brother, Leo. Life was hard, shaped by waking up before the sun to take 3 buses to work as a domestic maid, by counting pennies at the end of the month to decide between food and medicine, by daydreaming about a future that seemed destined never to arrive. But Maya had something that poverty couldn't steal: an extraordinary mind and an insatiable hunger for learning. From a young age, she demonstrated an uncommon ease with numbers. While other children struggled with multiplication tables, Maya solved math problems that were taught in grades far beyond her own. Her elementary and middle school teachers noticed, marveled, but had no resources to properly nurture that talent. It was in the neighborhood public library that Maya found her refuge. There, surrounded by old books and slow computers, she devoured everything she could find about mathematics. She watched online classes in videos that loaded slowly, solved exercises in notebooks she bought with the money she earned helping neighbors with schoolwork. She studied on her own, without private tutors, without expensive courses, just with her determination and an unstable internet connection. When the university's social equity program appeared, Maya saw a door open. She studied like she had never studied before, sacrificed nights of sleep, gave up jobs that could bring money to the family, and secured one of the rare spots destined for low-income students. Her mother cried when the news arrived, holding Maya's face between her calloused hands and saying she always knew her daughter was special, that she was destined for greater things. But being destined for something and effectively reaching that destiny were 2 very different things. Maya knew this better than anyone. She knew that every day at that university would be a battle. She knew she would be underestimated, questioned, and tested in ways her privileged colleagues never would be. And she was willing to face it all. The next day, when Maya arrived at the university, she noticed something had changed. As she walked through the hallways, students she had never seen before looked at her with recognition. Some nodded, others whispered as she passed. The story of what had happened in Dr. Richard Thorne's class had spread with the speed characteristic of university gossip. Maya was putting her materials in the locker assigned to her when a voice behind her made her turn. "Are you Maya Sterling?" The man standing before her was around 60 years old, with well-groomed grey hair and kind eyes, behind discreetly framed glasses. He wore a wool sweater over a dress shirt and carried a soft leather briefcase that showed years of affectionate use. There was something in his posture that transmitted authority, but an authority very different from what Richard exuded. This was the authority of lived knowledge, of accumulated experience, of wisdom conquered over time. "I am, sir," Maya replied, closing the locker. "My name is Henry Alcott. I'm a professor in the pure mathematics department. I heard about what happened yesterday in Richard's class." Maya felt her stomach tighten. Was another test coming? Another attempt to prove she didn't belong there? But Henry smiled, and it was a genuine smile without apparent ulterior motives. "I was impressed when they told me about the solution you presented. Richard can be many things, but incompetent isn't one of them. If he was left speechless, it's because you truly showed something exceptional." Maya didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to praise from authority figures, especially not in that environment. "I'd like to talk to you if you have the time," Henry continued. "There's a room on the 4th floor, number 412. It's my research office. How about we stop by after your classes today? No pressure, just a conversation." Maya hesitated, but there was something in the way Henry spoke that made her trust him. "I can do that, Professor. At what time?" "Is 5 in the evening good for you?" Maya agreed, and Henry said goodbye with a gentle wave before heading down the hallway. She stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. She didn't know it yet, but that meeting would completely change the trajectory of her life at that university. Meanwhile, in his office on the 3rd floor, Richard Thorne was rereading for the 10th time the notes he had made on Maya's resolution. The more he looked, the more bothered he became. It wasn't possible that a girl without resources, without the best professors, without the privileged background he and his colleagues always had, could demonstrate that level of understanding. There had to be some explanation, and he was determined to find it. At 5 in the evening that day, Maya climbed the stairs to the 4th floor with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. The Institute of Mathematics and Statistics building was quieter at that hour, with most students already gone. Her steps echoed through the empty hallways as she looked for room 412. When she finally found it, the door was ajar. Maya knocked lightly on the wood. "Come in, Maya, I'm waiting for you." Henry's voice came from inside the room, welcoming and calm. Maya pushed the door open and found herself in an environment completely different from the classrooms she knew. That was clearly a research space, filled with shelves packed with books, piles of academic papers, whiteboards covered in equations and diagrams, and an old wooden desk where Henry was sitting, reviewing some papers. "Sit down, please," he said, pointing to a comfortable chair near his desk. "Would you like some coffee? I just made some." Maya accepted, more out of nervousness than an actual desire for coffee. Henry served 2 cups from a pot on a small electric stove in the corner of the room. The aroma was strong and inviting, different from the watered-down coffee she was used to drinking at home. "So, Maya," Henry began, settling into his chair and looking at her with those kind eyes, "tell me a bit about yourself, not about your mathematical skills. That's already more than evident. I want to know your story. How did you get here?" No one had ever asked Maya that question, at least not the way Henry did, with genuine curiosity and without apparent judgment. She started slowly, hesitantly, but as she spoke, the words began to flow more easily. She told him about the South End projects, about her mother who worked tirelessly to support the family, about the mornings she woke up before dawn to study while the house was still silent. She spoke about the public library that had become her second home, about the videos she watched repeatedly until she understood each concept, about the used books she bought at thrift stores with money she saved cent by cent. Henry listened in silence, but Maya could see in his face that he was truly listening. It wasn't that polite, distant listening some people faked. It was true attention. When she finished, Henry remained silent for a few moments, as if processing everything he had just heard. Then he stood up and walked to one of the shelves, pulling out an old book with a worn blue cover. "You know, Maya, I didn't come from a privileged family either. My father was a worker in a textile factory in rural Pennsylvania. My mother sewed on the side to supplement our income. When I got a scholarship to study in Philadelphia, many said I was dreaming too big, that people like us weren't made for universities." He returned to his chair, holding the book affectionately. "This book was the first one I bought with money from my own work. I was 18 and worked nights as a security guard in a commercial building to pay for my studies. I read every page so many times I can recite passages from memory. It taught me more than math. It taught me that talent doesn't recognize social class, that knowledge doesn't ask permission to flourish in brilliant minds, regardless of where they were born." Maya felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't pity she saw in Henry's eyes, but recognition. He understood. "You have a special gift, Maya," Henry continued. "But more importantly than that, you have determination and a unique way of seeing problems. I saw your notes in Richard's class. The way you reached that alternative solution demonstrates not just technical knowledge, but creative thinking. That is rare, very rare." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. "I'd like to mentor you if you'll accept. Not officially, not yet, but I can help you with study materials, introduce you to research areas that might interest you, and be available when you have questions or need to talk about your path here." Maya felt her eyes sting. She wasn't used to kindness, especially not from someone in a position of power. She had always been taught to be suspicious, to protect herself, not to expect help from anyone because help always came with a price. "So why are you doing this, sir?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Henry smiled. "Because someone did it for me many years ago. A professor saw beyond my worn clothes and my country accent. He saw potential and decided to invest time in me. It changed my life completely. Now it's my turn to give back." That afternoon, Maya and Henry talked for more than 2 hours. He showed her rare books from his personal collection, explained advanced concepts clearly and accessibly, and shared stories of his own academic journey. When Maya finally left room 412, it was past 7 in the evening, and she carried with her not only borrowed books but also renewed hope. The following weeks brought a remarkable transformation. Maya began visiting Henry's office regularly, always after her classes. There, in that sanctuary of knowledge, she flourished. Henry introduced her to areas of mathematics she didn't even know existed, challenged her with problems that required creativity beyond technique, and taught her that asking questions wasn't a sign of weakness, but of intelligence. In the classroom, Maya was changing too. She was no longer the shy girl sitting in the back. She began participating in discussions, asking questions, and contributing alternative solutions when problems were presented. Some classmates began seeking her out for study groups. Among them was Ryan, a young man with brown hair and sharp eyes who always sat in the third row and showed genuine admiration for the way Maya thought. Ryan came from a middle-class family. His father was an engineer and his mother a high school teacher. He didn't have the arrogance of his wealthier peers, but he also didn't fully understand the difficulties Maya faced. Even so, there was a genuine connection between them, built on a shared love for math and long hours studying together in the library. But not all was harmony. Richard watched everything with growing irritation. He saw how Maya stood out more and more, how other professors began commenting on that exceptional student who had appeared out of nowhere, and how even his own research assistants mentioned her name with admiration, and it gnawed at him from the inside. To Richard, it didn't make sense. He had spent his entire life building his reputation, studying at the best institutions, paying fortunes for courses and specializations. How was it possible that a girl from a project, without the resources he always had, could demonstrate a level of understanding that rivaled his own? There had to be some explanation beyond natural talent. He began asking questions. Discreetly, he investigated Maya's academic background. He discovered she came from a standard public school with no history of significant academic awards or participation in national math Olympiads. There was nothing in her past that justified that exceptional performance. Richard also noticed that Maya frequented Henry's office, and that bothered him even more. Henry had always been his silent rival within the department. While Richard sought glory and external recognition, Henry was content with forming extraordinary students. Their approaches were diametrically opposed, and for years they had maintained a polite but distant relationship. Seeing Henry mentor Maya felt in Richard's eyes like an affirmation that his own method was wrong, and Richard Thorne did not tolerate being wrong. One Thursday afternoon after his last class of the day, Richard decided to confront Henry. He went up to the 4th floor and knocked firmly on the door of room 412. "Come in," said Henry, without looking up from the papers he was reviewing. Richard entered and closed the door behind him. "We need to talk about Maya Sterling." Henry finally looked up, removing his glasses and cleaning them carefully with a handkerchief. "Talk about what exactly?" "About how convenient it is that she appeared out of nowhere and demonstrated this level of knowledge in the very first class," Richard replied, his voice heavy with insinuation. "About how curious it is that you rushed to take her as a protégé. About the possibility that not everything is as genuine as it seems." Henry put his glasses back on and looked at Richard with an expression that mixed disappointment and weariness. "Richard, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that perhaps we should investigate her credentials better. Verify if she truly has the knowledge she claims to have. A formal test, perhaps, something that cannot be prepared for in advance." Henry leaned back in his chair, studying his colleague closely. "You're afraid of her, aren't you?" Richard was visibly offended. "Afraid? What exactly should I be afraid of?" "That she proves your teaching method, your arrogance, your need to humiliate students to feel superior, is completely unnecessary. That a girl who came from where she came from, without the privileges you've always had, could be better than you expected. That maybe, just maybe, true talent doesn't need important last names or fat bank accounts to flourish." The silence that followed was dense and heavy. Richard clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "I'm going to propose a test to the department board, something formal, documented. If she is as brilliant as you believe, She will have no problem demonstrating it again, but this time under controlled conditions. Henry sighed. Do what you feel is necessary, Richard, but know that you aren't just testing Maya, you are testing yourself. Richard left the room, slamming the door. Henry remained seated, worried. He knew Richard had enough influence to make it official, and he also knew that no matter how brilliant Maya was, being placed under that kind of pressure with the entire academic community watching could be devastating. That night, Henry called Maya and asked her to come to the university earlier the next day. There was something important they needed to discuss. Maya hung up the phone with a heavy heart. For the first time since she had entered that university, she felt something that felt very much like fear. Maya arrived at the university even before the sun had fully risen. The sky over the city had that orange hue typical of early autumn mornings, mixed with a light mist that hadn't yet dissipated. She hadn't slept well. Henry's call from the night before echoed in her mind, each word weighing like a stone in her stomach. Henry was waiting for her at the institute entrance, holding 2 coffees in disposable cups. When he saw Maya approach, he noticed the dark circles under her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. Let's walk a bit before we go up, he suggested, offering her one of the coffees. They walked through the campus gardens, still silent at that hour. Maya took small sips of the hot coffee, waiting for Henry to start the conversation they both knew was necessary. Richard got what he wanted, Henry finally began. The department board approved a formal competency evaluation. It's not common, but he argued that, given your entry through the social equity program, it would be important to formally document your skills to avoid future questioning. Maya stopped walking. He doesn't believe I'm capable. He thinks I cheated somehow. Henry placed a hand gently on her shoulder. What he believes or doesn't believe doesn't matter. What matters is that you know the truth, and I know the truth. This evaluation is just a formality. You're going to do what you've already done before, just in a different context. Maya looked at the horizon, where the sun was now starting to appear fully. But it's different, Professor. Before I was proving it to myself. Now I'll be proving it to people who have already decided I shouldn't be here. People who look at me and see only someone who doesn't belong. Henry waited for her to finish, respecting her moment of vulnerability. Do you know what I've learned over the years, Maya? That there will always be people who doubt you. No matter how many times you prove your worth, there will always be someone ready to question it. But here's the secret, he paused, letting his words gain weight. You don't need to prove anything to them. You just need to keep being who you are. The rest is consequence. Maya nodded, feeling something strengthen inside her. It wasn't pure confidence, there was still fear, but it was a renewed determination. If they wanted a test, she would give them a test they wouldn't forget. The evaluation was set for the following Friday in a larger auditorium, with the presence of not only the department board, but also other professors and even some students. Richard had ensured it became an event, a public demonstration that, in his mind, would finally reveal the fraud he was certain existed. The days leading up to the test were the hardest since Maya had entered the university. She studied even more intensely than before, but now with an additional weight on her shoulders. At night, in her small apartment in the South End, her mother watched her with concern. "Honey, you're killing yourself studying," Sarah said, placing a plate of food forcefully in front of Maya. "It's no use having all the knowledge in the world if you don't have the health to use it." Maya looked at her mother, at those hands calloused by hard work, at the face marked by the worries of a difficult life, and felt a pang in her chest. Sarah had sacrificed so much so she could have this opportunity. She couldn't fail. "I need to do this, Mom. I need to prove I deserve to be there." Sarah sat down beside her daughter and held her face with both hands. "You don't need to prove anything, Maya. You are already extraordinary. You always were. Those rich people at the university are the ones who need to learn to see what's right in front of them." But Maya knew it wasn't that simple. She knew the world didn't function based on justice or pure merit. She knew she would have to be twice as good, 3 times as prepared, just to be considered equal. Ryan had also become a constant presence in those days. He studied with her in the library, brought books he thought might help, and offered silent support just by being there. During one of the breaks, while they were getting water in the hallway, He finally said what he had been thinking for days. "You know you don't have to go through this alone, right? There are people here who believe in you." Maya smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "I know, and that makes all the difference." There was a moment of silence between them, loaded with things unsaid. Ryan opened his mouth as if to say something more, but then held back. It wasn't the right moment, but Maya noticed, and she stored that moment in her heart like a small treasure. Friday arrived too fast and too slow at the same time. Maya woke up with a knot in her stomach, but forced herself to eat the breakfast her mother prepared. Leo, her 15-year-old brother, gave her a tight hug before she left. "Go out there and show them who Maya Sterling is," he said, with the unshakable confidence of the young. In the auditorium, Maya found a scene that made her swallow hard. There were at least 50 people there. Professors occupied the front rows, and students filled the rest of the space. In the center, there was a table with 3 professors who would compose the evaluation board. Richard was among them, his upright posture and satisfied look making it clear he believed he was about to unmask a fake. Henry was sitting in the second row, and when his eyes met Maya's, he made a subtle gesture of encouragement. Ryan was a few rows back, clutching a notebook against his chest, as if he wanted to be ready to write down every moment of it. The board chair, Professor Beatrice Campbell, a woman in her 50s with her hair in a severe bun, called Maya to the front. "Miss Sterling, this evaluation consists of 3 parts. First, you will receive a theoretical problem which you must solve and explain your reasoning. Second, you will answer conceptual questions about different areas of mathematics. Third, you will present a proof of a theorem we will choose randomly. Do you understand?" Maya nodded, her voice coming out firmer than she expected. "Yes, Professor." The first part began. The problem presented was indeed complex, involving algebraic topology and group theory. Maya looked at the board, felt the weight of all those stares on her, and then something happened. The fear transformed into focus, the pressure converted into clarity. She began to write, and as she wrote, something magical happened. The equations flowed naturally, as if they were a language she had spoken forever. Each step was explained with crystal clarity, each transformation justified with precision. It wasn't just a technical resolution, it was a masterclass. When she reached a crossroads in the problem where there were 2 possible approaches, Maya stopped and turned to the board. "Here there are 2 possible paths. I will demonstrate both to show how they reach the same result but through different routes." And she did exactly that, developing both solutions with equal mastery. The auditorium was in absolute silence. Even Richard had lost his expression of confident superiority and was now watching with a mixture of incredulity and something that seemed dangerously close to respect. The second part was equally impressive. The questions came fast and varied, jumping from real analysis to differential geometry, from probability to mathematical logic. Maya answered with confidence, demonstrating not just memorized knowledge, but deep understanding. It was in the third part that something unexpected happened. Professor Campbell chose a particularly difficult theorem, Tikhonov's theorem, known for its complex and non-intuitive proof. It was the kind of theorem that even graduate students had difficulty proving properly. Maya looked at the name of the theorem written on the board, and for the first time since the evaluation began, hesitated. Not because she didn't know the proof, but because she knew how deep and complex it was. "May I start by contextualizing the historical importance of this theorem before starting the formal proof?" she asked. "Please do," replied Professor Campbell, genuinely curious. And then Maya did something no one expected. She didn't just prove the theorem, she taught it. She began by explaining why the theorem was important, what problems it solved, and how it connected with other areas of mathematics. Only then did she initiate the formal proof, but doing so in a way that made every step comprehensible, every logical jump justified. When she finished, there were discreet tears in the eyes of some of the older professors. They weren't tears of pity or condescension, but of recognition. They were witnessing something rare, a truly exceptional mind in action. Professor Campbell looked at the other board members. Richard said nothing, his face a carefully composed mask. The third member, Professor George Miller, a geometry specialist, cleared his throat. "Miss Sterling, in my 35 years of teaching mathematics, I have rarely seen a proof so clear and pedagogically effective. Your understanding is remarkable." Maya felt her legs weaken, but she stood firm. Professor Campbell made some notes and then looked directly at Maya. "I believe I can speak for my colleagues when I say there is no doubt regarding your competence. You not only meet the standards of this university, you exceed them significantly." It was then that Richard finally spoke, his voice contained but loaded with emotion he could barely disguise. "But how? How does someone without access to the resources we had, without the private tutors, without the elite schools, reach this level?" Maya looked directly at him, and in her eyes there was no anger or resentment. There was only a calm sadness. "Perhaps, Professor, the question isn't how I succeeded, but why you think only people with resources can love knowledge enough to pursue it with everything they have." The silence that followed was profound. Henry had tears in his eyes, Ryan was smiling openly, and Richard, for the first time in a long time, had no answer. The days following the formal evaluation brought changes Maya could never have imagined. News of what had happened in that auditorium spread through the university like wildfire. Students who had previously ignored her now greeted her in the hallways. Professors from other departments made a point of meeting her. Even the institute's administration expressed interest in her journey. But the most significant change wasn't in external attitudes. It was within Maya herself. She walked through the university hallways with a different posture. It wasn't arrogance, far from it. It was the quiet confidence of someone who finally understood she deserved to be there. She no longer needed to hide at the back of the classrooms. She no longer needed to offer silent apologies for her existence in that space. One morning, about 2 weeks after the evaluation, Maya was in the library working on an article Henry had suggested she read when Ryan sat down beside her with 2 coffees and a shy smile. "Thought you might need some fuel," he said, pushing one of the cups toward her. Maya accepted with a smile of thanks. In the last few days, Ryan had become an even more constant presence in her life. They studied together, ate lunch together, and sometimes just talked about things that had nothing to do with math. He made her laugh with stories about his crazy family, shared his own insecurities about the future, and listened with genuine attention when she spoke about her dreams. "I was thinking," Ryan began, nervously stirring his own coffee, "there's an event on Saturday, a lecture on applications of mathematics in artificial intelligence. I thought it might be interesting. Would you like to go? With me, I mean, together." Maya looked at him and noticed the slight blush rising in his cheeks. It wasn't just an invitation to a lecture. It was something more. "I'd love to," she replied, feeling her own heart race a little. The smile that lit up Ryan's face was worth more than all the perfect grades she had ever received. Meanwhile, in his office on the 3rd floor, Richard Thorne faced his own demons. Since the evaluation, he had become quieter, more introspective. Classes continued, but something had changed. He was still demanding, still maintained high standards, but the unnecessary cruelty had disappeared. He no longer humiliated students publicly. He no longer used knowledge as a weapon to wound. One afternoon, he did something he never thought he would do. He knocked on the door of room 412. Henry opened the door, and for a moment, the 2 men just looked at each other. There were decades of silent rivalry between them, years of opposite approaches, different worlds of values. "May I come in?" Richard asked. And there was something in his voice Henry had never heard before, humility. Henry stepped aside, allowing Richard to enter. He closed the door and waited. Richard stood for a moment, as if gathering courage, then sat heavily in one of the chairs. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him physical effort. "About Maya, about many things, actually." Henry sat in his own chair, waiting for Richard to continue. "I spent my whole life believing that excellence could only come from specific places, from people with the right resources, the right background. I used that to justify my own importance, to feel superior. And when someone appeared who challenged that entire narrative I had built, my first reaction was to destroy her, rather than question my own beliefs." He paused, looking at his hands. "That girl showed me something I had forgotten a long time ago, or maybe never really understood. That true knowledge knows no barriers. That talent can flourish anywhere, and that sometimes the best professors are the ones who learn from their students." Henry studied his colleague for a long moment. "Richard, what are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that I want to change. I don't know if it's possible to teach an old dog new tricks, but I'd like to try. And I was thinking," he hesitated, "maybe you could help me with that." Henry felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't victory he felt, but a cautious hope that maybe people could truly change. "I would be honored to have that conversation with you, Richard, but I think there's someone you should talk to first." The following months brought an even greater transformation. Maya was invited to present a seminar on her unique approaches to problem solving. The room was packed, with students sitting on the floor and standing along the sides. She spoke for an hour, and her passion for knowledge was so contagious that even the most skeptical left inspired. Ryan became more than a friend. On a rainy night in June, while they were studying together in the library and the rain drummed against the windows, he finally gathered the courage to hold her hand. Maya intertwined her fingers with his, and no words were necessary. They understood each other on a level that went beyond the equations they both loved. Sarah, when Maya told her about Ryan, held her daughter's face with her hard-working hands and said with tears in her eyes that she was happy Maya had found someone who saw what she always knew was there, an extraordinary girl who deserved all the good things in the world. Leo also thrived, inspired by his sister's success. His teachers commented on how he had become more dedicated to his studies, how he spoke about one day also going to the university, and how Maya's story had become his North Star. One day in May, when the dogwoods began to bloom and paint the city white and pink, Richard sought Maya out in the hallway. She was talking to some classmates when she saw him approach. There was a moment of tension, memories of that first day rushing back. "Miss Sterling, could I speak with you for a moment?" Maya said goodbye to her classmates and stood alone with Richard. He looked uncomfortable, almost vulnerable. "I would like to apologize," he began, and Maya noticed his hands were trembling slightly, "for the way I treated you, for what I did, for the assumptions I made based on nothing but my own prejudice and insecurity." Maya watched him in silence, letting him finish. "You taught me more that day than I've taught any student in years. You taught me about humility, about recognizing value wherever it appears, about the importance of not judging a book by its cover." He paused. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better because of you." Maya took a deep breath. She could hold a grudge. She had every right to do so. But looking at that man before her, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, she chose a different path. "Professor Thorne, we all carry prejudices. What matters is what we do when we realize them. The fact that you are here having this conversation already says a lot." Richard nodded, his eyes shining with contained emotion. "Thank you, Miss Sterling, for everything." As he walked away, Maya felt something release in her chest. It wasn't just about forgiving Richard. It was about realizing she had become bigger than the circumstances that tried to define her, bigger than the prejudice she faced, bigger than the doubts that once consumed her. The years at the university passed in a whirlwind of discovery, growth, and transformation. Maya graduated with the highest honors the institution could offer. She was accepted into a prestigious doctoral program. Her articles began to be published in international journals. Henry mentored her with the dedication of an academic father, watching her flourish into something even more extraordinary than he had imagined. Ryan graduated in the same year, and although their academic paths took different directions, he going into applied engineering and she into pure mathematics, the love they had built remained solid. On a December afternoon, under the blooming trees, he asked Maya to marry him. She said yes through tears of joy, thinking about how her life had changed since that first scary day in room 207. Sarah was in the front row at graduation, wearing her best dress, tears flowing freely down her face as she saw her daughter receive her diploma. Leo, now preparing for his own university exams, shouted louder than anyone when Maya's name was called. Henry, sitting among the professors, smiled with paternal pride. And Richard, who had become a very different educator over those years, applauded with genuine sincerity, recognizing that the young woman had changed not only her own life, but the lives of everyone who had the privilege of witnessing her journey. Maya Sterling was no longer the shy girl in worn sneakers who had entered that room years ago. She was a confident woman, a respected scholar, someone who had proven that dreams don't ask for permission from those born in projects or palaces. They only ask for the courage to be pursued. But her story was far from over. In fact, she was just beginning to write the next chapter, a chapter that would take her back to the place where it all began, but this time with a completely different purpose. A purpose that would honor everyone who helped her along the way. A purpose that would change lives the same way hers had been changed. And it would all start with a classroom, a whiteboard, and a look that would recognize in someone the same fire that had once burned in her own eyes. 8 years had passed since Maya Sterling first stepped into the hallways of the Institute of Mathematics and Statistics as an insecure and underestimated student. Now, on a clear September morning, she returned to that same place, but the circumstances could not be more different. Dr. Maya Sterling, internationally recognized for her contributions to number theory and algebraic topology, had just accepted a position as a tenured professor in the department that had once doubted her. At 28, she was one of the most promising researchers of her generation, with articles published in the world's most prestigious scientific journals and invitations to lecture at universities across 5 continents. But it wasn't the titles or the recognition that made her walk through the hallways that morning with a smile on her face. It was the opportunity to give back, the chance to be for others what Henry had been for her. Maya climbed the stairs toward the 3rd floor, where room 207 was located. Her first class would be right there, in the same space where her story at that university had begun so painfully. She had specifically requested that room, not out of masochism, but for symbolism. She wanted to transform that space that once represented exclusion into a place of welcome. Upon reaching the hallway, Maya saw Henry waiting for her, leaning against the wall near the room. He was older, his hair now completely white, but his kind eyes were the same. When he saw her, his face lit up with a proud smile. "My dear Maya," he said, opening his arms for a hug, "or should I say Professor Sterling?" Maya hugged him tight, feeling for a moment like that 19-year-old girl again who had found in him an academic father. "To you always, Maya," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. Henry stepped back and looked at her with admiration. "I'm so proud of you, of everything you've achieved. But more than that, I'm proud of the person you've become. You could have let the past harden you, but you chose to let it strengthen you." Maya smiled, discreetly wiping a tear that insisted on falling. "I learned from the best, Professor." They entered room 207 together. Maya looked around, allowing herself to feel the weight of the memories. There was the desk where she had sat on that first day. There was the board where she had proven her worth for the first time. There was the space that had witnessed so much fear, so much pain, but also so much growth. Students began to arrive. Maya watched each face, each expression, trying to see beyond appearances. Some arrived with expensive backpacks and the latest laptops. Others carried old notebooks and simple pens. Maya knew it wasn't appearance that defined someone's potential. She had learned that the hardest way possible. When the room was almost full, the door opened once more. A young woman hurried in, apologizing for the delay. She wore simple clothes, carried a worn backpack, and had in her eyes that mixture of determination and insecurity that Maya knew so well. The girl looked around for a place to sit. Some students watched her with curiosity, others with that veiled disdain Maya remembered so well. The young woman found an empty desk and sat down quickly, taking an old notebook and a pen from her backpack. Maya felt her heart tighten. It was like looking into a mirror of the past. "Good morning, everyone," Maya began, her voice firm but welcoming. "Welcome to Advanced Calculus and Number Theory. My name is Maya Sterling, and it will be a pleasure to share this semester with you." She paused, her eyes scanning the room and landing briefly on the young woman who had just arrived. "Before we begin, I want to make something very clear. In this room, it doesn't matter where you come from, what clothes you wear, what brand of notebook you carry, or how much money your parents have in the bank. What matters here is your will to learn, your curiosity, your dedication, and your respect for one another." Maya saw the young woman in simple clothes look up, surprised. Mathematics doesn't recognize important last names or privileged addresses. It reveals itself to those willing to dedicate time, energy, and passion to understand it. And I will be here to support each of you on this journey, regardless of how many difficulties you face or where you started. The room was silent, But it was a different silence from the one Maya remembered from her first days. It was a silence of attention, of respect. Maya began the class, and her way of teaching was completely different from what she had experienced as a student. She didn't use knowledge as a weapon, she used it as a bridge. When she noticed someone didn't understand, she stopped and explained it again in a different way. When she saw a student hesitant to ask a question, she encouraged them with a gentle smile. She transformed the classroom into a safe space to fail, learn, and grow. During the break, the young woman in simple clothes approached timidly. "Professor Sterling, sorry to bother you. My name is Julie Foster. I wanted to thank you for what you said at the start of class." Maya smiled warmly. "No need to thank me, Julie. I only spoke the truth. Where are you from?" "I'm from the East River Projects, Professor. I got in through the Social Equity Program." Maya felt a shiver run down her spine. It was almost scary how history repeated itself. "East River," Maya said with a knowing smile. "You know, I'm from the South End Projects. I also got in here through the Social Equity Program 8 years ago." Julie's eyes widened. But you're a tenured professor. You're known internationally. I read your articles when I was preparing to come here." Maya sat at one of the desks and signaled for Julie to do the same. "And do you think that happened overnight? That it was easy? Julie, when I started here, I was underestimated, questioned, and tested in ways my privileged colleagues never were. There were days I thought about giving up, days I cried on the bus home because I felt invisible. But I also found people who believed in me, who gave me opportunities, who taught me that I deserved to be here as much as anyone else." Julie had tears in her eyes. "Sometimes I feel so out of place," she confessed in a low voice, "as if everyone knows something I don't, as if I'm pretending to be something I'm not." Maya held the young woman's hand gently. "Julie, listen carefully. You are not pretending. You earned your place here through your own merit, and I'm going to tell you something someone very wise once told me. You have a gift. More importantly, you have determination. Those two things together can take you further than you imagine. And if you need help, guidance, or someone to talk to, my door will always be open." At that moment, the classroom door opened. Richard Thorne entered, now with a few grey hairs in his dark hair. When he saw Maya, his face lit up with a genuine smile, so different from that arrogant smile of years ago. "Professor Sterling," he said, extending his hand, "I came to officially welcome you to the department." Maya shook his hand, and between them there was now only mutual respect and a shared understanding of how much they both had grown. "Thank you, Professor Thorne. It's good to be back." Richard looked at Julie, who was still sitting beside Maya, and his look was kind. "Miss Foster, isn't it? I saw your name on the enrollment list. Excellent performance in the selection process. It will be a pleasure to have you in my classes as well." Julie murmured a thank you, clearly surprised by the kindness. When Richard left, Maya turned back to Julie. "You know, that professor was the one who challenged me in this very room 8 years ago, who tested me harshly, who doubted me. But do you know what happened? He learned. He changed. People can grow, Julie. They can recognize their mistakes and become better. Never give up on people. And most importantly, never give up on yourself." At the end of that first day, Maya remained alone in room 207 for a few minutes. Ryan, who now worked as an engineer at a large firm but always found time to pick up his wife after her classes, waited outside, respecting that moment of reflection. Maya looked at the board, at the desks, at the space that had witnessed her transformation. She thought of Sarah, who no longer had to work as a maid because Maya and Leo, who had also entered university, could support the family. She thought of Henry, who remained her mentor and dearest friend. She thought of Richard, who had proven that redemption was possible. She thought of Ryan, her life partner, who loved her not despite her origins, but including everything she was. And she thought of Julie, and all the Julies and Mayas yet to come, carrying dreams bigger than the circumstances that tried to limit them. Maya smiled. Her journey had been difficult, painful at times, but every scar had been worth it, because now she wasn't just living her dream, she was helping others live theirs. She picked up her bag and walked toward the door. Before turning off the light, she looked at the room one last time and whispered to herself, like a promise she made to the universe, and to that 19-year-old girl from 8 years ago who still lived in her heart. No one who enters here will be invisible. No one will be underestimated. No one will be judged by appearances. Everyone will have the chance I had. Everyone will be seen. And with that, she turned off the light and closed the door, knowing that the next day she would return to open it again, not just to teach mathematics, but to transform lives. Because true knowledge does not depend on appearance, status, or origin, and the way someone is treated can define not just a moment, but the impact that experience will have on the future. What began as an act of snap judgment ended as a powerful lesson in respect, recognition, and transformation. And that lesson would continue to be taught, one classroom at a time, one life at a time, forever. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Maya Sterling has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by the journey of this extraordinary young woman, if you felt the strength of her determination and the beauty of her transformation, leave a like on this episode, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment struck you the most. Every